Under the dark sky of Vayner Prime, war had arrived without warning. The alien city's glowing towers burned as ships roared overhead, their engines screaming through the smoke-filled air. The streets shook with the force of orbital strikes, sending rubble crashing down into the crowded alleys. Amid the chaos, soldiers dragged away prisoners, their chains rattling against the cold metal ground. Somewhere in that mess of fire and ash, a young alien girl with fox-like ears was torn from her home, her cries drowned in the thunder of battle. She was thrown into a steel cage deep in the lower levels of the enemy's holding compound. Air there was damp, and the faint smell of rust mixed with something far worse. Her clothes were torn from the scuffle, replaced with rough, coarse fabric that barely kept out the cold. The bars pressed into her skin whenever she shifted, and the shadows of guards passed by with little interest in the trembling figure within. Her golden hair was matted from the dirt, yet her eyes, bright and alive, still searched the darkness for hope. Outside the compound, a human soldier named Carter moved quickly through the ruins. His orders were to search for survivors and recover any important intelligence. The war had thrown him into places he had never thought he'd see, and this alien city was one of them. He had learned to keep his head down and his rifle ready, but something in the back of his mind told him the mission would not go as planned tonight. Carter was not known for following rules to the letter. He believed in doing what was right, even if it meant bending orders. When his squad split up to search different sectors, he moved deeper into the enemy's perimeter. His boots crunched over broken glass, and the distant sound of gunfire echoed through the streets. The air grew heavier the closer he got to the heart of the city, where the enemy's prisoners were kept. The alien girl huddled in the far corner of her cage, her tail wrapped tightly around herself for comfort. She had tried calling for help earlier, but the guards only laughed. Her throat was raw from the effort, yet the silence around her felt worse than their mocking voices. She closed her eyes and thought of her home, of the warm light that once filled her family's halls, but the cold reality of the bars against her skin reminded her it was gone. Carter paused when he heard something faint, a sound that didn't belong in the rhythm of battle. It was soft, fragile, almost lost in the echo of the compound walls. He stepped closer, ears straining, until the sound came again, a cry. It wasn't the sharp shout of a wounded soldier, but a desperate, trembling voice calling for someone, anyone. His grip on his rifle tightened, and he followed the sound into the shadows. The dim light revealed rows of cages, some empty, others holding figures too weak to move. His eyes swept across them until they stopped on her. She was sitting close to the bars, her face half hidden by the strands of her tangled hair, her ears twitching slightly as if sensing his presence. When their eyes met, she didn't speak, but the look she gave him was enough to break through the noise of the war outside. Carter knelt by the bars, lowering his weapon. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. She blinked, unsure if she could trust him, but something in his tone made her lean closer. Her hands reached toward his, trembling, and for the first time since the battle began, her cry carried not just fear but hope. Carter's heart raced as he scanned the hallway for guards. The compound's main chamber was close, and there was no telling how many soldiers could appear at any moment. He pressed his palm to the cold bars of her cage, feeling the faint warmth of her trembling hands through the metal. Her eyes darted to the shadows, fear still sharp in her movements, yet she didn't pull away from him. The girl's voice came out low and rough, speaking in her native tongue. Carter didn't understand the words, but the pain in them was unmistakable. He kept his voice calm, using slow gestures to signal that he meant no harm. She tilted her head slightly, trying to follow his meaning. Then she whispered something that made his gut tighten. She was the last of her kind left in the city. Somewhere in the compound, heavy boots struck the ground in rhythm. The sound was getting closer. Carter glanced around for a way to break the lock, but found nothing nearby that wouldn't make too much noise. His rifle was slung across his back, but using it would draw every enemy within earshot. He had to think fast if he wanted to get her out alive. The girl noticed his hesitation. Her ears twitched as she looked toward the approaching sound. She pressed her hand harder against the bars, her fingers brushing his skin for a brief moment. There was no time for her to ask questions. Her eyes told him she didn't need to. Either he acted now or both of them would never leave. Carter spotted a narrow maintenance corridor to his left. It was dark and lined with pipes, the kind of path that might lead behind the cells. If he could reach the back of her cage, there might be a weak point in the frame. He pointed toward the corridor, and she gave a tiny nod. With one last look down the main hall, he slipped into the shadows. The maintenance path was cramped and smelled of oil and dust. His footsteps were muffled on the metal grating beneath him. Every few meters he could hear voices on the other side of the wall, but they didn't seem to notice him. He kept his rifle ready, though he prayed he wouldn't have to fire it in such close quarters. The narrow space soon opened to a small hatch that looked directly into the back of her cage. She turned when she heard the faint sound of the hatch unlocking. Her expression shifted from fear to surprise, and for the first time, a faint spark lit in her eyes. Carter worked quickly, loosening bolts with the knife from his belt. Each one gave a faint metallic groan as it turned, and they both froze at every noise. Still, he kept going, knowing that each bolt brought her closer to freedom. When the final bolt came loose, he eased the panel away just enough for her to squeeze through. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if she couldn't believe she was being freed. Then she crawled forward, her movements quiet but quick. Her furred ears brushed against his arm as she passed through, and he could feel her breath catch in relief as she stood beside him for the first time. Carter held a finger to his lips, urging her to stay silent. The main exit was too far and too exposed. They would need to move deeper into the maintenance tunnels and find another way out of the compound. She stayed close behind him, her bare feet making no sound on the metal floor. For someone who had been locked away, she moved with surprising grace. A sudden burst of shouting echoed from the main chamber. The guards had discovered the open cage. Carter picked up the pace, leading her through a maze of pipes and narrow turns. The noise behind them grew louder, and soon the sound of boots followed. He knew the tunnels wouldn't keep them safe for long. But for now she was out of the cage, and he had no intention of letting her go back. Under the dim glow of the tunnel lights, Carter led the alien girl deeper into the maze of maintenance shafts. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and oil, and every sound seemed to echo far louder than it should. He glanced back often to check on her, noting how her bright eyes scanned the path ahead with both fear and determination. She moved silently, her ears twitching at every distant noise. The walls closed in as the tunnel narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Carter kept his rifle ready, though his main focus was finding an exit that wouldn't lead them straight into enemy patrols. The girl's breathing was light, but the tension in her movements told him she understood how dangerous their situation was. Her tail flicked once, betraying her nerves, before she steadied herself and kept moving. A faint vibration trembled through the floor beneath their feet. Carter stopped, pressing his palm to the metal. The thrum was steady, mechanical, and getting louder. Somewhere ahead, machinery was running, which meant they might be close to a power station or ventilation hub. Both could offer a way out, but they could also be heavily guarded. He turned to the girl and made a quick hand signal to slow down. They reached a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. Carter crouched, studying the markings stenciled on the walls. Most were in an alien script he couldn't read, but one bore a universal warning sign for hazardous energy output. He decided to avoid that path, choosing instead the leftmost tunnel, where the air felt cooler and carried a faint scent of the outside. The girl kept close to his back as they advanced. Her head tilted slightly, ears angling toward the sounds. Ahead, she caught something before he did, a faint metallic clang that repeated at intervals. Carter froze, listening more intently now. The noise wasn't random. It was footsteps on a metal surface, coming toward them. He stepped sideways into a darker recess of the tunnel, pulling her gently with him. 2 enemy soldiers passed by, their alien armor catching the dim light. They spoke in low tones, one carrying a weapon slung over his shoulder, the other scanning the path with a small handheld device. Carter's grip tightened on his rifle, but he waited until their voices faded and their footsteps merged into the hum of the machinery. Only then did he step out again, the girl following without a sound. The tunnel opened into a large chamber filled with pipes, vents, and a slow-turning fan the size of a transport truck. A single grated walkway crossed the room, leading to another exit on the far side. Carter scanned the area for movement, but saw none. He motioned for her to follow him across, each step making the walkway groan under their weight. She kept her eyes on the shadows, her fingers brushing the railing as if ready to leap away at the first sign of danger. Halfway across, the fan's steady hum changed pitch, grinding loudly as if something inside had shifted. Carter froze, scanning for the source of the noise. A sudden rush of warm air blasted from one of the vents, carrying the smell of burning metal. Somewhere in the system, a malfunction had triggered. The girl's ears flattened, and she reached for his arm. He gave her a small nod, urging her to keep going despite the noise. They reached the far exit and stepped into another narrow shaft. This one sloped upward, the air growing fresher with each step. The faint light ahead hinted at an opening. Carter's chest tightened at the thought of getting her outside, but he knew they couldn't relax yet. If the guards found the damaged cage, they'd be searching every possible escape route by now. The girl moved slightly ahead, her pace quickening as she caught the scent of open air. Carter followed close behind, scanning the tunnel walls for security devices. The light grew brighter until they emerged into a small service yard enclosed by high walls. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was a step closer. For the first time since he found her, Carter allowed himself a flicker of hope. Carter scanned the yard quickly, taking in every possible path. The high walls were topped with jagged metal and loose wiring, clearly meant to stop anyone from climbing over. A row of storage units lined one side, their doors half rusted but intact. The other side was open to a heavy service gate, locked with a thick chain. The girl stood beside him, her sharp gaze moving just as fast as his. He crouched beside the gate to check the lock. It was reinforced, the kind that would take time to cut or break, time they didn't have. The sound of distant shouting drifted into the yard, carried by the echo of the tunnels. Carter's jaw tightened. The search was spreading. He turned to the girl and motioned toward the storage units. Her ears twitched, and she gave a small nod before following. They moved to the first unit, Carter pressing an ear to the metal door. Inside it was silent. He pulled it open slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. Dust floated in the shaft of sunlight, spilling from a crack in the roof. Old tools and crates were stacked inside, some marked with symbols he didn't recognize. He stepped in carefully, scanning for anything useful. The girl lingered near the doorway, her tail low but her eyes sharp. In the corner, Carter found a coiled length of heavy chain and a set of pry bars. The tools were worn, but solid. They could break the lock on the gate if used right. He picked them up, testing the weight in his hands. The girl stepped forward, her fingers brushing over one of the crates. She tilted her head, then pushed the lid aside. Inside were sealed containers of water and ration packs, likely forgotten during the chaos of war. Carter handed her one of the bottles, and she accepted it with both hands. She drank slowly, almost reverently, as if she hadn't had clean water. In days, the sight made his chest tighten. He took one last look around the unit before leading her back into the yard. The shouting was louder now, but still distant enough to give them a small window of escape. At the gate, he positioned the pry bar between the chain links. Metal groaned under the strain, but it didn't snap immediately. The girl watched the yard entrance, her ears flicking at every sound. Carter shifted his grip and forced more pressure onto the tool. With a sharp crack, one of the links gave way, and the chain slid to the ground. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, just enough for them to slip through. Beyond the gate, a narrow service road wound between more high walls. The path led uphill, and the air was cooler here. The girl walked beside him now, keeping her steps quiet. Every so often, she glanced behind them, her eyes catching the faint glint of movement in the shadows far back. Carter noticed it too. The enemy was tracking them, even if they hadn't closed the distance yet. The road curved to the right, revealing a break in the wall ahead. Beyond it lay the wreckage of a transport yard, the remains of vehicles scattered like broken toys. Carter led her through the gap, weaving between twisted metal and shattered glass. The smell of fuel lingered in the air, mixed with the dust of long-abandoned cargo. Here, the noise from the compound was muffled, but the danger was no less real. Near the far end of the yard, they found a partially intact transport. Its frame was bent, but the cabin was still sealed. Carter climbed up to check inside. The controls were dead, but the storage compartment was locked with a weaker latch. A quick strike from the pry bar broke it open, revealing a small flare. Gun, a half-empty medkit, and a worn blanket. He tossed the blanket to the girl, who wrapped it tightly around her shoulders. Carter's mind raced as he looked back toward the road. They couldn't stay in the yard long, but the flare gun could be their lifeline if they needed to signal for help. He met the girl's eyes, and she gave a small, steady nod. She was ready to keep moving. Together, they slipped out the far side of the yard, the open landscape ahead promising both danger and the first true step toward freedom. The open terrain stretched before them, a mix of cracked earth and patches of stubborn weeds clinging to life. The air was sharper here, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the burning city behind them. Carter kept his rifle ready, scanning the horizon for movement. The girl walked just behind him, the blanket wrapped around her small frame as she followed his pace. They moved along a shallow ridge, keeping low to avoid being spotted from a distance. The wind tugged at Carter's gear, whistling through the gaps in the rocks. Every few steps he paused to listen, catching only the faint echo of engines somewhere far off. The girl's ears twitched as she listened too, her gaze shifting toward the distant hills that marked the edge of the enemy's territory. A cluster of half-collapsed buildings came into view ahead. Their stone walls were cracked and weathered, with vines creeping through the gaps. Carter approached cautiously, signaling for the girl to stay close. They slipped inside one of the larger structures, the air cool and musty. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and shards of glass crunched under their boots. In one corner, Carter found an old storage trunk. Its lid was warped, but he managed to pry it open. Inside were a few blankets, a cracked lantern, and a pouch filled with small metal discs. He didn't know their purpose, but they could be useful later. The girl knelt beside a broken window, peering out toward the horizon. Her eyes narrowed, and she gestured for him to look. A patrol of enemy soldiers was moving across the plains in the distance. Their armor caught the sunlight, and the glint of their weapons was unmistakable. Carter's jaw tightened as he calculated the distance. They had time, but not much. He motioned for the girl to gather what she could from the trunk. She quickly took one of the blankets and a small metal disc, tucking them away beneath her own blanket. They left the building through a back doorway, weaving through the ruins toward a narrow gully. The dry earth crumbled underfoot, sending small stones tumbling down the slope. Carter guided her to the bottom, where a thin stream of water ran through the dust. It was barely enough to drink, but the girl cupped her hands and sipped gratefully. He let her drink before urging her onward. The gully led them toward a cluster of low hills. The ground here was softer, and the air smelled faintly of rain despite the dry sky. Carter knew the hills could offer cover, but they could also hide enemies waiting in ambush. He climbed the first slope slowly, checking each ridge before motioning for her to follow. She moved with quiet steps, her eyes scanning as sharply as his. At the crest of the hill, they stopped to rest. The city was now a smudge of smoke on the horizon, and the open land ahead stretched for miles. Carter crouched beside a patch of dry grass, setting his rifle down for a moment. The girl sat nearby, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at him then, her eyes holding something different now, a mixture of trust and determination. From their vantage point, Carter spotted a narrow path winding through the hills. It led toward what appeared to be a small outpost, its metal walls glinting faintly in the sunlight. He didn't know if it was abandoned or occupied, but it was their best chance for shelter before nightfall. He pointed it out to the girl, and she gave a single decisive nod. They rose together and began the descent, keeping to the shadows where the terrain allowed. The air grew still, the only sound their footsteps on the dry ground. Ahead, the outpost loomed larger with each step, its shape becoming clearer. Carter felt the weight of the flare gun at his side and the girl's presence at his back. They were far from safe, but each step forward was another step away from the cage. The outpost stood silent as Carter and the girl approached, its metal walls weathered by years of wind and dust. The main gate hung open just enough for a person to slip through, and the lack of guards made Carter uneasy. He motioned for her to stay behind him as they stepped inside, his rifle sweeping the corners of the yard. The ground was littered with scraps of metal and broken crates, signs that this place had been abandoned in a hurry. They moved toward the central building, its door leaning on one hinge. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of burnt wiring. A row of control panels lined one wall, most dark and lifeless, though a few flickered weakly. Carter tested a switch, but nothing responded. The girl explored the room quietly, her fingers brushing across the dusty surfaces as if searching for something familiar. In the corner, Carter found a small storage room. Its shelves were mostly bare, but a few sealed ration packs and a container of clean water remained. He handed the girl one of the packs, and she tore it open carefully. For a moment, the tension in her face eased as she took small bites. Carter drank a little water, then refilled his canteen. Every bit of supply mattered if they were going to keep moving. The sound of engines broke the stillness, faint at first, but quickly growing louder. Carter froze, glancing toward the open doorway. The girl's ears twitched sharply, and she moved closer to him instinctively. He signaled for her to follow, leading her to the back of the building where a smaller exit led to a covered walkway. They slipped through just as the hum of engines turned into the clatter of landing gears. Peering from the shadows, Carter saw an enemy patrol transport touching down in the yard they had entered from. Soldiers disembarked quickly, spreading out, with weapons ready. The leader barked orders in a sharp tone, pointing toward the building they had just left. Carter's mind raced. They had to move before the patrol began a full search. He guided the girl toward a row of cargo containers stacked against the wall. The containers provided good cover, but they also boxed them in. Carter scanned for an opening and spotted a narrow gap between two of the larger crates. He crouched low, slipping into the space and pulling the girl after him. The metal was cold against his back as they pressed close to avoid detection. Footsteps passed on the other side, the clink of armor and weapons close enough to hear clearly. When the noise faded slightly, Carter led her along the edge of the yard to a service ladder bolted to the wall. It led up to a catwalk that stretched above the outpost. Climbing quickly, He kept one hand ready on his weapon while the other gripped the rungs. The girl followed without hesitation, her movements light and quick despite the height. From above, they could see the patrol sweeping the area below. They crossed the catwalk to the far side, where another ladder descended into a narrow alley behind the outpost. The alley opened into the rocky hills beyond, offering them a chance to disappear again. Carter dropped down first, scanning the path before helping her down. The air here was cooler, and the sound of the engines was fading behind them. For the moment, they had escaped. The girl looked at him with a faint smile, the first he had seen since freeing her from the cage. It was small, almost shy, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He knew the danger wasn't over, but seeing her find even a little comfort gave him strength. They turned toward the winding path ahead, the hills hiding them from sight as they moved on. Every step took them farther from the burning city, and the compound where she had been left to die. The road ahead was uncertain, but Carter's grip on his rifle was steady, and the girl stayed close at his side. Whatever lay beyond the next rise, they would face it together, no longer captor and prisoner, but allies bound by survival. The winding path through the hills was narrow, forcing Carter and the girl to walk in single file. Loose stones slid beneath their boots, clattering softly down the slopes. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the rugged ground. Carter kept his pace steady, glancing back every so often to make sure she was close. The air grew cooler as they climbed higher. Patches of hardy plants clung to the rocks, swaying gently in the breeze. The girl's ears twitched at every distant sound, her instincts alert to danger. Carter trusted her senses as much as his own. They had escaped the patrol, but he knew they could still be tracked if the enemy was determined enough. At the crest of the next hill, they found a small plateau overlooking the valley below. From here, Carter could see the faint outline of a settlement far in the distance. The buildings were clustered tightly, surrounded by makeshift walls and towers. It might be a place to rest, but it could also be under enemy control. The girl followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as if she recognized it. They rested briefly in the shelter of a rock formation. Carter shared what was left of the water, and she accepted it with quiet gratitude. Her tail flicked once as she studied the horizon. He could tell she was weighing the risks in her mind. Trust between them had grown, but neither could ignore the fact that every step carried its own dangers. When they set out again, the path curved sharply downward into a rocky gorge. The sound of rushing water grew louder with each step, until a narrow stream appeared at the bottom. Its clear water glistened in the fading sunlight. The girl crouched to drink while Carter scanned the surrounding cliffs for movement. The gorge walls offered cover, but they also left few escape routes if they were found. Halfway through the gorge, Carter spotted fresh boot prints in the damp soil near the stream. They were recent and headed in the same direction they were going. His stomach tightened. It could mean a scouting party was ahead. He motioned for the girl to move quietly, her steps becoming even lighter as they pressed on. Every sound seemed sharper in the enclosed space. They soon reached a bend in the gorge where the walls closed in tightly. Just beyond, Carter caught sight of a faint flicker of light firelight. He dropped to one knee, signaling for her to stay low. Peering around the corner, he saw two figures in dark armor sitting beside a small campfire. Their weapons were propped against a rock, and they seemed to be speaking in low voices. Carter weighed his options quickly. Sneaking past was possible, but risky if they were spotted. A confrontation could draw more attention. The girl's eyes met his, and she gave a small nod, as if to say she trusted his choice. He decided on silence. Moving slowly, they hugged the wall of the gorge, keeping to the deepest shadows until the firelight was behind them. Once they were safely past, Carter allowed them to pick up the pace. The gorge widened again, and the sound of the stream faded. Ahead, the terrain began to level out, leading toward the distant settlement. The sky was now streaked with orange and red, the first stars beginning to show. It was still a long walk, but they were making progress. The girl glanced at him as they walked, her expression softer than before. She no longer moved like someone expecting to be dragged back to a cage. Instead, her steps carried a quiet determination. Carter noticed it and felt a faint sense of pride. They were still in danger, but now they moved forward as partners with a shared goal, each step taking them closer to whatever awaited in that distant settlement. The settlement drew closer with each step, its walls now clear in the fading light. Carter could see crude watchtowers made of metal scraps and wooden beams, with figures moving along the top. He slowed his pace, studying the defenses. The girl stayed beside him, her eyes fixed on the gates ahead. There was tension in her posture, as though she knew what kind of welcome they might receive. They approached the entrance cautiously. 2 guards stood outside, their weapons primitive compared to the enemy soldiers they had fled from. One of them raised a hand to stop them, his gaze moving between Carter and the girl. He spoke in a language Carter didn't understand, but the girl stepped forward, answering in quick, firm words. The guard's eyes widened slightly before he gestured for them to wait. After a brief exchange between the guards, the gates creaked open. The inside of the settlement was crowded with small shelters and busy walkways. People moved quickly, glancing at the newcomers with curiosity and caution. Carter kept his rifle lowered but ready, aware of the weight of every stare. The girl walked with more confidence now, her ears high as she guided him through the narrow streets. They were led to a central building made from a mix of stone and scavenged metal. Inside, the air was warmer, lit by the flicker of oil lamps. An older alien with a weathered face sat at a table, his eyes sharp as they studied Carter. The girl spoke to him in the same steady tone she had used with the guards. Carter could only guess, but her gestures made it clear she was telling their story. The elder listened in silence, then stood and approached. His gaze lingered on Carter. For a long moment before he placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, she seemed to relax under his touch. Turning to Carter, the elder gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had been done. Though no words passed between them, the meaning was clear. Carter had earned a place here. At least for now. A meal was brought to them, simple but filling. Carter ate slowly, taking the time to let his muscles relax. The girl spoke quietly, with the elder occasionally glancing at him. He didn't need to understand the words to know she was defending him. It struck him how far she had come from the frightened figure in the cage to someone who could stand before her people without fear. Later, they were given a small shelter for the night. The walls were thin, but the space was warm and quiet. Carter sat by the entrance, watching the faint light from the settlement's fires outside. The girl sat across from him, her golden hair catching the glow. For a long time they didn't speak. The silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind that came from knowing they had both survived something that should have ended them. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. She told him, in halting words he could understand, that he had saved not just her life but her spirit. Carter didn't answer right away, but the way he met her gaze said enough. She smiled faintly, and in that moment, the memory of the cage seemed like a distant shadow, replaced by the light of freedom. Outside, the night air carried the sound of distant winds and the quiet hum of the settlement at rest. Carter leaned back against the wall, his rifle within reach, but his mind was calmer than it had been in days. The girl curled up under her blanket, her breathing steady. For the first time since this began, he believed they might have a future. Beyond running, whatever came next, whether the war found them again or peace managed to hold, they would face it side by side. The bond forged in fire, fear, and survival was unbreakable now. Carter closed his eyes, knowing that this was no longer just about escape. It was about protecting the life they had fought so hard to reclaim, together.